The war in North Africa began in earnest on the 9th of December 1940. Hitler watched with caustic amusement as Benito Mussolini tried to expand the Italian Empire in North Africa. Il Duce's armies crept tentatively from Libya into Egypt. Then the British counterattacked. Italy was threatened with the annihilation of her forces and the total loss of her colonies. Germany would have to come to the rescue. The Italian disaster threatened Fortress Europe. For his own security, Hitler felt that he had no option but to intervene on behalf of his ally. By the middle of February 1941, the first contingent of German support had reached Tripoli. It was not very large. In fact, it consisted of one general and 2 staff officers. But the general was a man called Rommel. As the commander of the Ghost Division in France, General-Major Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel had won a reputation as a brilliant commander. His orders were to stabilize the situation. Rommel's force initially included only the 5th Light Division. For the moment, he was expected to stiffen Italian resistance. Perhaps in due course, he would be given the resources to do more, but he was to await orders from above before contemplating offensive action. But Rommel would not wait. Within days, he was planning a full-scale counterattack, and with that began 2 years of cut-and-thrust battles with British and Commonwealth forces. The battlefield was to be the Libyan desert, an area aptly described as a tactician's paradise and a quartermaster's nightmare. Disobeying orders with the diligence that compels respect, Rommel moved the German 5th Light Division from Tripoli towards Agadarbiya on the 24th of March. There, on the 3rd of April, Rommel set up his headquarters. He then cast aside all established principles of warfare by deliberately splitting the already tenuous forces at his disposal into 3. He sent a mixed German and Italian force under Graf von Schwerin eastwards in a wide arc. While this passed through Jof el-Matar and Tenjeda towards Mekelle, he directed the bulk of the 5th Light to advance through Antalat and Massus. Rommel himself accompanied the armored cars and light vehicles of the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion to the north, towards Suluk. Then, having heard rumors that the British were evacuating Benghazi, he ordered them to drive straight for the port. Here his troops were welcomed as conquering heroes. The Afrika Korps had come to liberate the Italian Empire in Cyrenaica, and the joy at seeing the advancing Germans appeared genuine. However, the wild enthusiasm exhibited by the inhabitants reminded one American observer of the jubilation with which the Australians had been received only a few months before. The desert taught the lessons of pragmatism. Now free to maneuver in open desert, Rommel pushed his reinforcements forward. With numerical and, more importantly, psychological advantage, the Germans surged east. The British were now in headlong retreat, being harried all the way by the Axis air forces, which enjoyed total control of the skies. The Luftwaffe was assisted by a large contingent of the Italian Air Force. Although the Italians' machines were inferior to the German and Allied aircraft, they gave capable support. Even their obsolete biplane, the Fiat Falco, was able to conduct ground attack missions. Axis aircraft, when permitted by the treacherous winter weather in the desert, repeatedly bombed and strafed the retreating British columns and saw off the little resistance put up by the Royal Air Force. In this environment, the Zersturers and Stukas could attack with impunity. By the 7th of April, Rommel had captured Derna and isolated Mekelle, and his reconnaissance units were probing eastward south of Tobruk. Mekelle fell to the Germans on the morning of the 8th of April, and the victorious Panzer troops encountered the all too familiar evidence of a broken enemy. All around was the detritus of a fleeing army, abandoned tanks, troop carriers and trucks, and of course, the bodies of fallen. By the 9th, Rommel's reconnaissance units reached Bardia, with the Egyptian frontier, Halfa Pass and Sollum just a few miles on. Some surviving British formations were scurrying past them towards the bases from which they had launched their own offensive only 4 months previously. But many had no opportunity to flee. Large numbers were surrounded, and others had already surrendered. Rommel's headlong advance recovered all the territory lost by the Italians. He was soon talking to his staff about Egypt and the Suez Canal, but he would have to take into account the reactions of the Italians. It is worth noting that the Axis forces in North Africa remained under Italian command until early 1943. At this time, Rommel was only a corps commander. Not only was the theater commander in Africa an Italian, but so were the majority of Rommel's troops. In that lay part of the problem. Italian units had dash and élan, but no endurance. Importantly, in the mobile warfare for which Rommel was so suited, their infantry divisions were not mechanized and so could rarely exploit the successes of German armor. All of the Afrika Korps units were mobile, and therefore the German infantry could keep pace with the panzers and exploit the breaches made in the Allied lines. Under Rommel's leadership, 2 Italian divisions, the Ariete Armored Division and the Trieste Motorized Division, fought extremely well. The rest of the forces were of varying levels of mediocrity, and when under pressure could be counted upon to fold like a house of cards. They did, however, prove reasonably effective if corseted at key points by intermingling with German units. The quality of Italian arms was also suspect. In spite of the appearance given by triumphalist propaganda, Italy's economy was not geared to produce the quantity of equipment required of a modern war. The tanks that she did field were slow, undergunned, and poorly armored. They were christened mobile coffins by their crews. The same pre-war models were produced right up until the Italian surrender, no funds being made available for weapons development. It should be remembered that the German units were also equipped with pre-war tank types. The Type 2 and 3 Panzers could do little in a shootout against the heavily armored British Matildas and Valentines. But the Wehrmacht had shown in France that it was the way you used your tanks which brought success, and Rommel's mastery of mobile war more than made up for any weaknesses in his armor. Numbers also helped, and Rommel would need adequate reinforcement and supply. For this, he had to rely upon the Italian merchant navy. But here was another problem, because the Axis did not control the Mediterranean shipping lanes. The Royal Navy attacked Italian convoys with merciless professionalism. Cruiser and destroyer squadrons sorted from Egypt and submarines from the island of Malta, which lay conveniently astride the convoy routes. By the end of 1942, Italy had hardly a merchant ship left in service. The rest were at the bottom of the Mediterranean. The Desert War was unusual in many respects. There were few cities, few obstacles to the rapid movement of mechanized forces. Armies required vast quantities of petrol and water. Supplies of fresh vegetables and fruit were scarce for both sides. Without enough water to drink, there was certainly none to be spared for washing. Occupation of oases was vital to both sides. Any fight over a water source was guaranteed to be hard, and when won, was enjoyed to the full by the troops. Getting supplies to the advancing troops was a hell in its own right. More than in any other theater, this was a war won by logistics. The length of the supply lines dictated the yo-yo nature of the North African campaign. The further from the supply port, the more difficult it was to sustain the advance. Conditions were not helped by the poor state of the roads, deeply rutted dust tracks in the summer and quagmires in the winter. Consequently, there were never enough supplies. Rommel insisted on eating the same rations as his men, and his health steadily deteriorated as a result. His officers fell by the wayside too. Yet if the climate was unforgiving, the conventions of the Desert War harked back to more civilized days. Rommel was a star on the Nazi propaganda machine, yet had no time for the ideology of the Untermensch. There were no SS units in Africa, no Einsatzgruppen, and the civilian population, such as it was, consisted of Arab nomads, often well disposed to the Germans. Allied prisoners, often a collection of units from all over the British Empire, and of all creeds and colors, could expect reasonable treatment from their captors and would not starve, even when the Germans themselves did not have enough. Rommel's forces reached the key port of Tobruk on the 10th of April 1941, but a hastily organized assault was beaten off by the Australian garrison. Rommel's offensive attracted the interest of the General Staff, which dispatched Generaloberst Friedrich Paulus to investigate. He was not impressed, describing Rommel as headstrong. Paulus also worried that what had begun as a sideshow could become a major drain on resources, just as the invasion of Russia was about to begin. Arguments about German offensive aims in Africa were rendered academic by a succession of British attacks. In May, General Wavell launched Operation Brevity, which was defeated. In June, they tried again, this time reinforced with nearly 300 new tanks shipped from England. Operation Battleaxe showed Rommel and the Afrika Korps at their best. British armored units tried to seek out and engage Rommel's armor in a tank-v-tank battle. But the Germans made masterful use of their towed anti-tank guns, firing from well-concealed positions. They inflicted terrible losses before the panzers wheeled in from a flank to finish the business. The Luftwaffe's 88mm anti-aircraft guns were pressed into service in a ground row, since the Army's standard 37mm weapon could not penetrate the British infantry tanks, Matilda and Valentine. In 3 days' fighting, known as the Battle of Sollum by the Germans, the Afrika Korps demonstrated its superior leadership and vastly better staff work. Wavell was sacked and replaced by General Auchinleck, who was pressed by London to renew the attack and relieve Tobruk, still besieged by the Axis forces. Both sides sent reinforcements, but Germany had little to spare as the invasion of the USSR was now in full swing. Rommel developed jaundice in August, but soldiered on, his forces now designated Panzergruppe Afrika. Tobruk was the key. By capturing the port, Rommel would get his supplies landed just behind the front, instead of having them driven the hundreds of kilometers of coast road from Benghazi. Thanks to the ultra code breakers, the British knew all about Rommel's plans for Tobruk. They deliberately staged their own offensive within days of the planned German assault. On the 17th of November, Rommel's signal staff reported complete English radio silence. He ignored them, and ignored the first reports of a major British attack. The British 8th Army under Lieutenant General Cunningham advanced to relieve Tobruk, its powerful tank force surging across the desert to find and destroy the German armor. On the 19th of November, the key airfield at Sidi Rezegh was overrun by British tanks. Rommel was reluctant to abandon his own attack on Tobruk, but when he reacted, he did so with his usual vigor. Fighting raged around Sidi Rezegh until the 23rd of November, the combatants maneuvering aggressively in the open terrain. There was no real front line. Both sides had headquarters units and supply columns taken by surprise by enemy tanks. Both sides suffered heavily, but had only a hazy idea of their opponent's losses. In such a battle, psychological strength is a priceless asset. On the 24th of November, Rommel struck out behind the British, heading for the Egyptian frontier, rather than staying to beat back the British assault along the coast road. It was a daring move, but it left the German commander out of touch with his own headquarters for several days. Cunningham, who had narrowly avoided capture in the chaotic battle, was sacked by Auchinleck. The British commander-in-chief placed his own chief of staff, Lieutenant General Ritchie, in command of the 8th Army. Rommel's dash to the wire failed to relieve the small garrisons left in the wake of the British advance. His own staff regarded it as premature, and it was ended on his own initiative by Oberstleutnant Westphal at Rommel's HQ, who ordered 21st Panzer Division back to Tobruk. Rommel remained out of communication as he raced around the battlefield, micromanaging the operation. Rommel admitted defeat and fell back towards Gazala. But there was no obvious defense line, and he soon announced that the retreat must go on back to the Gulf of Sirte. There, in bad weather and worse tempers, Operation Crusader, or the Winter Battle as the Germans called it, fizzled out in the desolate sands around El Aguila. It had been from there 9 long months before that Rommel had launched the first spectacular advance of the Afrika Korps. It seemed as though history was repeating itself. The victorious British, scattered and disorganized after a long advance, the Axis pushed back deep into its own territory. But as it would soon prove, the Afrika Korps had recoiled like a spring. By January 1942, it was compressed, ready to be unleashed. The Benghazi handicap, as some wags had dubbed it, was not over yet. Rommel had excellent intelligence from reconnaissance and decrypted enemy radio traffic. In January 1942, he knew that he had a window of opportunity to counterattack. The British were preparing their own offensive, but judged the Axis forces too weakened by their recent defeat and withdrawal to be capable of immediate action. In contrast to the divided counsels of the British 8th Army, Rommel was very much his own man. Theoretically subordinate to Army Command Southwest and the Italian High Command, he would ignore his German superiors. His Italian superiors only learned of his plans once their own formations were discovered to be on the move. Both sides knew the Germans had landed over 100 new tanks in North Africa. This was, as Rommel's chief of staff, Fritz Bayerlein, remarked, as good as a victory in battle. Some of these new tanks were the up-gunned Mark IVs, better than anything the British could field. Rommel was not the man to allow either men or material to stay idle if he could see a worthwhile purpose for their employment. On the 21st of January 1942, the Axis forces caught the British by surprise, who was soon again in helter-skelter retreat. By the 10th of February, weary, weather-worn, thirsty, but triumphant, Panzer Army Africa, under their remarkable leader, was well back into Marmarika, with Tobruk, for so long their apparently unobtainable objective, again only 35 miles beyond their grasp. In the meantime, Rommel's superior, Field Marshal Kesselring, advised against further precipitate action, at least until more men, more panzers, more ammunition, and especially more fuel were to hand. Even Rommel saw the wisdom of this, so for the moment, only his reconnaissance units pressed much further forward than Timimi. There they quickly found that Commonwealth troops had reassembled on a line running south from the Gazala inlet as far as the Beaugès-style fort at Bir Hakeim. In the north and center, they were in the process of building themselves defense positions of considerable strength. Deep minefields bridged the gap down to Bir Hakeim. It was clear the Panzer Army Africa would need all its expertise to break through or to bypass these defenses. Both sides were engaged in a logistic race to assemble as powerful a force as possible for the next battle. There was a strong argument for a German assault on Malta, from which the RAF and Royal Navy inflicted unsustainable losses on the Italian convoys on which Rommel's army depended. German and Italian airborne forces were assembled and trained for Operation Hercules, and the island was bombed by the Luftwaffe. Gibraltar could support no submarines or bomber aircraft under the ferocious aerial bombardment that ensued. Italian merchant ships enjoyed a welcome respite, and Rommel's forces were replenished. On the other hand, the first American supplies reached Egypt, including numbers of M3 medium tanks, known to the British as Lees and Grants. The M3 featured a 37mm gun in a turret, plus a 75mm gun in the hull. The vehicle could not fight hull down, but it compared well to the thin-skinned British cruiser tanks in widespread service, and being American, did not break down with the depressing regularity of so many British-built tanks. By mid-May, Rommel's battlefield reconnaissance teams detected signs that the British offensive was imminent. He was still outnumbered, but persuaded Kesselring to release many of his squadrons from the Malta operation, including dive bombers and Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs, then superior to any RAF fighters in North Africa. The British defenses consisted of a succession of fortified camps or boxes, occupied by infantry brigades with supporting artillery. Dug in behind barbed wire, with some 500,000 landmines surrounding them, they were designed to break up and channel the enemy attack. Behind these lines, the British armored divisions waited, theoretically concentrated and ready to deliver a knockout blow, but in reality scattered about the desert with confused command arrangements. Rommel believed the British did not understand the basic principles of war. In truth, his opponents grasped the theory. There was a failure of execution owing to the command by committee syndrome which prevailed in the 8th Army. Rommel had visited Hitler in March and personally obtained permission for a new offensive. His objective was Tobruk. His orders were to go no further and to return the Luftwaffe squadrons to Sicily within a month. His own correspondence reveals greater ambition. He planned, even before the Battle of Gazala, to break clean through to Egypt and the Suez Canal, converting a hoped-for local success into a major strategic victory. Rommel attacked on the 26th of May. Neither his plan nor that of the British survived first combat with the enemy. His feint at the center of the British line failed to draw the British reserves. His predictable wide flanking maneuver was not intercepted by British tank divisions, which sat immobile while their commanders bickered. General Cruel, commander of the Afrika Korps, was shot down in his light aircraft and captured. This occurred just as Kesselring was visiting the command post, and the Field Marshal and former gunner spent an enjoyable afternoon taking charge as senior officer present until Rommel arrived. For a commander often criticized for not paying regard to logistics, Rommel turned the tables on the British by personally organizing a night resupply for the 15th Panzer Division. His tanks had broken through the British lines, but found themselves surrounded. The British commanders believed they had him trapped. It is one of the classic illustrations that commanders are only beaten when they themselves believe it. Rommel's confidence was supreme, as witnessed by a captured British officer who described him directing this most confused of battles. Hunched over a map in his command vehicle, headphones on, Rommel issued an endless succession of orders with quiet authority. His confidence, his grip on the battle, in such dramatic contrast to the confusion on the other side. There was no real front line. Situation maps showed a hideously complex intermingling of forces. Victory went to the man who believed he would win. Defeat to commanders who deep down believed themselves and their system inferior. Fighting around the Knightsbridge box, held by the Guards Brigade, went in favor of the Germans. The southernmost anchor of the Allied line, the Free French position at Bir Hakeim, was attacked and taken after over a week of epic resistance. The British withdrew, their retreat taking on the appearance of a rout, as Rommel threw every last man and every precious liter of petrol into the pursuit. Suddenly, Tobruk was under threat. Rommel attacked the southeastern quadrant of Tobruk's defences at 5:20 a.m. on the morning of the 20th of June. Unfortunately for the British, they were convinced that the attack, when it came, would be from the southwest. Most of the artillery and the entire 2nd South African Division were stationed in the western half of the fortress. In addition, most of the mines which had been used at Gazala had been taken from the defences at Tobruk, weakening the southeastern perimeter at the point where Rommel launched his assault. The German attack went like clockwork. 3 hours after Kesselring's bombers had opened the offensive, the 15th Panzer Division punched through the British lines and fanned out. The Ariete and Trieste divisions exploited the gaping breach in the defences. Once the Axis troops were through the perimeter, they were able to roll up the defences in true blitzkrieg fashion. The next day, to the astonishment and fury of the British and Commonwealth troops still defending doggedly, a huge white flag was hoisted above brigade headquarters. As it flapped open in the first morning breeze, a great moan of disappointment, anguish and misery welled up from all over the western half of the garrison. Defeat is bitter in any circumstances, but now in the minds of thousands who were experiencing it, it was compounded by disgrace. Over 30,000 Allied prisoners were taken that day. As they moved off in a file, they passed a triumphant Rommel. Most probably did not recognize him. After all, which of their commanders would have shared the dangers of actual combat? The spoils were immense. 2,000 vehicles, 5,000 tons of supplies, and 2,000 tons of fuel were given up. Rommel now calculated that nothing stood between him and ultimate victory. The capture of Tobruk brought exultation to the Panzer Army and a field marshal's baton to Rommel. But there was to be no rest for either of them. Rommel dismissed the news of his promotion with the comment that he would far rather have had another Panzer division. To the congratulations of his staff, he responded with a brusque order: all units will assemble and prepare for further advance. For his eyes were now on the Egyptian frontier and the vast prize of the Nile Delta, the Suez Canal, and all the horizons beyond. Rommel answered remonstrances from Kesselring and the Italian commanders by saying that the enemy were in such disarray that they would be able to offer little or no resistance to the swift and powerful drive he was about to launch. He added that, with the store dumps of Tobruk now at his disposal, no critical shortage would impede his progress. As for previous plans and agreements, such overwhelming victories swept away the need for caution, a conclusion in which he was later supported by both Mussolini and Hitler. By the evening of the 22nd of June, 90th Light were in Bardia, and 21st Panzer were on their way to join them. By the following day, 15th Panzer and Ariete were closing up to the Egyptian frontier to the south, shepherding the remains of the 8th Army before them. Rommel himself was examining another huge supply dump, which 90th Light had seized at Fort Capuzzo, which contained particularly large quantities of fuel. Fortune was favoring the successful. For the British, the danse macabre of military disaster continued. Orders failed to get through, reports were late and inaccurate, battalions had lost confidence in their brigade command and support battalions. The infantry distrusted the armor. The artillery and engineers withdrew into a world of their own. A plan for holding the Panzer Army south of Mersa Matruh failed for a combination of many of those reasons. By the time it had been demonstrably shattered, Auchinleck had taken a step which many people, including Churchill, thought he should have taken much earlier. He sacked General Ritchie and took command of the battle himself. In doing so, he effectively saddled Ritchie with all the blame for the preceding disasters. But although Rommel seemed to have the upper hand, in truth the Allies were winning the all-important logistics war. It now took 3 weeks to ferry Axis supplies by road from the port at Tripoli. The port at Tobruk was not yet serviceable thanks to the demolition efforts of the retreating Royal Navy. Air reinforcements had relieved the pressure on Malta, and from July 1942, over a third of Axis shipping dispatched from Italy ended at the bottom of the Mediterranean. Allied air forces had built up a great store of British and American fighters, fighter bombers and bombers. Although the number of British planes in the sky gave eager Luftwaffe aces like Joachim Marseille the opportunity to build up vast scores, the ceaseless air combat was inevitably a drain on resources of fuel and skilled airmen. Rommel was also now to be deprived of his flying artillery, the Junkers 87, which was a sitting duck against modern aircraft types. The Luftwaffe was being inexorably driven from the skies. But the advantage to the British was not yet apparent. By the morning of the 29th of June, the Axis had passed Mersa Matruh and were driving along the coast road through Fuka and on to El Daba. The two Panzer divisions and Ariete were driving southwest towards El Qasir. Across the front of the German advance ran a desert track. It connected the impassable Katara depression to the south with the newly created wire-bound defense post around the little railway station of El Alamein, of which few people at that time had ever heard. Rommel's orders were short and clear. There was no reason to believe that these new British defenses would be any more difficult to smash than the countless others now to their rear. Although their commander did realize that after the tremendous efforts of the past 4 weeks they were exhausted, he called on his troops for one last supreme effort. But Rommel's iron will was not to be enough. The Axis had already experienced a succession of heavy bombing raids against which the Luftwaffe could only send an occasional lone Bf-109. Late on the afternoon of the 1st of July, the men of the 90th Light suddenly found themselves under a barrage the like of which none of them had ever experienced. Heavy guns, howitzers, light and medium field guns, mortars, anti-tank guns, all contributed to a storm of fire which shook even Rommel, who came hurrying up in an armored car immediately. The extent of the opposition to 90th Light's advance became evident. Auchinleck had found a way of stopping Rommel at last. Fighting continued for an intense 3 weeks, at the end of which Rommel had been pushed back only a mile. The battle had revealed with blinding clarity the lack of cooperation throughout the 8th Army. Its general amateurism compared poorly with the professionalism of the Afrika Korps, and the necessity for complete reorganization and thorough training was obvious. The first battle at Alamein produced one success and one failure for each side. Auchinleck had halted Rommel's drive for the Nile, but the Panzer Army was still in existence, and no one could foretell when it would strike again and whether or not it would succeed. Here, for the moment, both sides were forced to pause. Until resupply could be achieved, there was a lull in the fighting. Weary soldiers were given the opportunity to relax in their trenches and read mail from home. But everybody knew the quiet could not last. On the 30th of August, Rommel attacked again at Alam Halfa. The 4 days of battle which followed decided the Desert War. This time Rommel faced a new opponent. Auchinleck had appointed one Bernard Law Montgomery to command the 8th Army. The change in British fortunes at this time has often been ascribed, not least by Montgomery himself, to his assumption of command. But one man, no matter how influential, could not win on his own. The RAF had control of the skies and bombed German supply dumps and headquarters units with impunity. Rommel was sick, as were many of his 17,000 veterans who had fought in North Africa without a break for well over a year. And the British refused to play the old game. Their armor did not expend itself on suicidal charges into German anti-tank guns, but waited with artillery and air support for the Germans to come to them. the British displayed none of the unsteadiness Rommel scented earlier that summer. For the moment, his Plan Orient was on hold. The grandiose scheme endorsed by the Chancellery had been conceived of as a great pincer movement. Whilst the Wehrmacht thrust down through the Caucasus, the Afrika Korps would seize Suez. Once the two forces linked up, there would be an opportunity to drive eastwards until they met the Japanese. But even if Plan Orient had once been practical, its time had long passed. Rommel applied for leave. Fated in Berlin, where he stayed with the Goebbels family, he disconcerted his stand-in, General Stumme, with the statement that he would return if the British attacked. And attack they would, even if they were taking their time about it. As Rommel confided to his staff, "If I were Montgomery, we wouldn't still be here." The Second Battle of El Alamein was to take place just as Rommel had feared. Montgomery had a deep aversion, learned on the Western Front during the First World War, to squandering the lives of his troops. He resisted Churchill's demands for immediate action until everything was in place and victory assured. With dominance of the air, a substantial advantage in both infantry and tanks, and an artillery barrage organized on a scale not achieved by the British Army since 1918, Montgomery launched the sort of classic set-piece battle at which he excelled. Although they didn't know it, Montgomery's attack on the 23rd of October 1942 marked the beginning of the end for Hitler and the Nazis. The tide of war was turning irrevocably in favor of the Allies.